I heard something bizarre today, which just reminds us that the next war will be fought in ways like nothing we've seen before. Now, this is just a small example. It's probably more potentially hypothetically. Britain's Institute of the Motor Industry says there are between 100,000 and 300,000 electric cars built in China, and they're now all in Europe, that China could turn off with the flick of a switch, causing chaos, blocking roads, for instance. Any government electric cars that are Chinese will stop dead. Add to that, hacking of power facilities like we've already seen in the US, or the malware attacks that are now detected in US bases, malware that could slow down deployments when war breaks out. I tell you what, it's mind-blowing what could happen. But we've just been given a much bigger wake-up, and a seriously frightening one. It's in this book that was released last week by the RAND Corporation. That's a think tank which also does work for the US Defence and Intelligence Establishment. It's called Inflection Point: How to Reverse the Erosion of US and Allied Military Power and Influence. Now, like I say, it's frightening because it says the US military can't now beat China on its own, or even some other countries either that doesn't name. The military's been complacent, it's lost its technological edge, it hasn't got enough troops and weapons overseas to react in time if a war does break out. In short, it says America's defence strategy and posture have become insolvent. Joining me is the book's lead author, David Ochmanek, is a senior researcher at the RAND Corporation, a former Deputy Assistant Secretary for Defence for Force Development. David Ochmanek, thank you so much for joining me. Your report, I have to say, is frightening. Now, as you say in it, the 2 billion people who live in democracies ultimately do need the United States to be involved in the world and strong. But you say its military is no longer dominant. It can't even beat China, certainly not on its own, or even some other countries that you don't name. So what went wrong?
I think what we can, whenever you have a major accident in the airlines, for example, there's never one cause, or always a chain of causation. But I think the primary problem for American defense planners has been a sense of complacency. Our forces did so well against the third and fourth tier adversaries of Iraq, Serbia, Afghanistan, Libya, that they really took their eye off the ball as China, over a period of decades, methodically continued to build up its military capabilities. And our focus on countering terrorism around the world really compounded the problem. So we're only now sort of waking up to the fact that we've got a lot of catching up to do in terms of fielding the kinds of military capabilities and posture that are called for by a very much more capable adversary than we've been focused on for the last 30 years.
One of the things that's frightened me about the war in Ukraine is how quickly the United States and a lot of European countries have run out of the kind of spare munitions and equipment, military equipment, they've been sending to Ukraine to help it beat the Russian invaders. In what ways is the US military now weaker against its likely enemies?
Yeah, I would say, Andrew, that the United States has not gotten weaker over 30 years. But some of our adversaries have gotten considerably stronger, and we haven't kept pace. And catching up with that is going to involve more than just buying more and better weapons. It's going to involve changing the way we posture and maintain our forces in the Western Pacific, in Europe. It's going to mean finding a new way to fight that is very different from the way that we used so successfully against the Iraqs and the Serbias of the world. And yes, we Americans considered ourselves the arsenal of democracy in World War I and in World War II. When our factories were fully spun up, we were turning out tremendous quantities of weapons. Since the end of the Cold War, there's been a continuous consolidation of our defense base, from 20 or 30 major contractors down to literally 5. And over the years, we have systematically underinvested, particularly in missiles, in munitions. And so that part of the industrial base has to be reinvigorated.
Now, you say in this book, the United States can't respond to wars in the old ways, sit back and then send expeditionary forces from a distance to eventually overwhelm the enemy, like it did in Kuwait and in Iraq and in Libya. It really needs to put more men and equipment, and different equipment, much closer to likely battlefields before the war breaks out. And you mentioned, of course, Taiwan. How does Australia fit into that plan?
Yes, 2 points on that. First, that expeditionary approach that you talked about, that legacy approach to power projection, worked satisfactorily against the Iraqis, against the Serbians, because we had military dominance in all domains of warfare, air, sea, land, space, cyberspace. Once we engaged, we had the initiative. When you fight a China, that is not the case. They have qualitatively caught up to us. We're fighting in their backyard. They will sustain the initiative unless we find new ways to inject our power into their backyard very quickly. I want to offer a little bit of a correction to what you said. We need to be able to bring combat power to bear into China's backyard from the very outset of hostilities. That doesn't necessarily, well, that will involve, in part, putting more stuff forward to include places like Australia, Guam, etc. But it also will mean finding ways to generate combat power from places that China can't reach. I'm talking about Alaska, talking about Hawaii. I'm talking about undersea. So it's not all about putting more necessarily forward. It's about posturing ourselves for a very rapid response. And we know that Australia really is ideally located and ideally situated to be a power projection hub for the United States, because it's, ironically, it's not so close that it's within range of thousands of Chinese missiles, the way Okinawa is, or even Guam. And so that's why you saw in the recent AUKUS meetings an interest in pre-positioning U.S. materiel in Australia and having Army watercraft available to move things around within the theater, etc.
Well, if there is now a war with China, China invades Taiwan, say, and America responds like Joe Biden has said it would, how would that play out?
We've done dozens of war games on this, and there are some common themes that come out of those war games. If our blue teams, which is what we call the good guys, the United States and its allies and partners, if they hew to that tried and true legacy approach to power projection, if they use something like the current overseas posture that we have today, if they don't invest in larger quantities of new weapons and surveillance systems, China rapidly dominates the battle space between itself and Taiwan. They land tens of thousands of soldiers on the island, and they overwhelm Taiwan's defenses. However, if we have creative teams who think differently about how to fight, and who do not necessarily need cosmic new 21st century weapons. We're talking about some fairly prosaic things, hardening your air bases, buying more cruise missiles, putting large numbers of drones into the battle space to do reconnaissance, and they're postured for rapid response. We can defeat that invasion without having technological dominance over our adversary. And that's what we think, that's the direction we think our forces, not just the United States, but its allies and partners, need to move in the very near future.
David Ochmanek, thank you so much indeed for your time.